Welcome, everyone, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide. This is a three-part series, and today is Thursday, September 3rd, 2020. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing now a growing body of more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part one, World Trade Center Building 7. It's about the third tower, a 47-story skyscraper that collapsed suddenly and symmetrically around its own footprint, right into its own footprint in under 7 seconds at 5:20 in the afternoon on September 11th. But before we go further, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele. Hello, Andy.
Hey, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in today. I just want to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which will occur from time to time. And also, we will be taking questions at the end of the webinar today. You can submit them on our questions, or in rather, our questions and information form online at ae911truth.org. Just go to continuing education at the top of the website and select live webinars. You'll see the box to submit them. That's the best way to do it. But also, I'll be looking at our Facebook page and the YouTube broadcast as well of this webinar and finding any good comments or questions related to the material that we can ask as well. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. More recently, before launching full-time onto this outreach effort that is so important, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure. Altogether, about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time, though, educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So with that said, let's get into it. Maybe you didn't even know there was a third tower that collapsed on 9/11. Most architects and engineers don't, and that's absolutely incredible. This is the third worst structural failure in modern history, and yet most architects and engineers don't know anything about it. I mean, how does that even happen? I'm a member of the American Institute of Architects. We have 80,000, now 90,000 architects in our organization. We didn't receive one bulletin on this most catastrophic event, which was theoretically, or according to the official narrative, caused by fire. Well, we've never lost a skyscraper before due to fire. So this should have been the most studied building failure in history. You know, no plane hit this building, right? Here it is, standing about half the height of the Twin Towers. It was the tallest building in most of our states, though. And we have, it was obscured by the Twin Towers when they were brought down. When they were built, the tallest towers in the world at the time were the Twin Towers. So don't let that obscure the massive building that we're looking at here, 610 feet tall. North here it is here on the north of the building 6, just outside the super block of the World Trade Center complex, and it was built in '86 by Larry Silverstein was the developer. The architect of record was Emery Roth and Sons. It's about 100 yards north of the North Tower here. And again, it wasn't hit by a plane. So what happened to this building? Well, here it is after the towers come down, immediately following the collapse. You see the incredible dust clouds, which we will be talking about next week from the North Tower and the South Tower. But here it is standing, just fine after the collapse of those towers. It had a little bit of damage. NIST says this was an insignificant factor in the building's collapse. We'll get more into that, but let's take a look at the collapse of this building first. The east penthouse collapses first, and then 6 seconds later, the entire building drops straight down into its own footprint. What we're going to do is break this down and the official story. Let's begin with that. Here's Shyam Sunder, project leader of the NIST report, talking about the cause of this building's failure.
What we found was that uncontrolled building
I can't
fires
hear that,
caused
Andy.
an extraordinary event.
Can you?
The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Oh, I got to change my speaker. Andy, tell me if you can hear that or not. Hang on one second. I gotta make an adjustment here. I'm on my headset, and that's always no good. Let's try that again. All right. Oh. Now PowerPoint.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Primarily due to fires. Okay. So it's not jet plane impacts, obviously. We don't have a jet hitting this building. Let's look at those fires. These are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of in this building. They're few, they're relatively small, and they're scattered. And they are on the east side, near column 79 in the early afternoon. But by about 3 p.m., they're moving from the east over to the west, which is to the right. And I got to make a correction on that slide I just see right now. And so here is NIST's theory. They focus on column 79 and its collapse. It was underneath the east penthouse, which did collapse first, as you saw. So they claim some massive damage on the south side, but whatever the damage on the south, they also say that was not a significant factor in the building's collapse. And so they have a fire simulation that they have put forward, showing fires beginning at about 2 p.m. on the south side, working their way around the east side to the north side, all the while hanging around column 79 for at least a couple of hours, which is a problem in terms of the duration of those fires in any given area. We'll talk about that in a moment. Well, I'll talk about it right now. They say these fires, and this contradicts their fire simulation, that these fires didn't persist in any one location for more than 20 or 30 minutes. So how could they be hanging around that column? Well, because this is the key point of their whole initiation failure, as we'll find out. But the videos, in this case, a still from this video, shows that these fires had burned out on the 12th floor, moved on toward the east, moving from east to west, from left to right. They're gone in this area on the 12th floor and the 13th floor. These floors down here are not a part of the initiation collapse theory. So they move also, though, to the east. So AE 911 Truth has produced a simulation, which is just a series of graphics to show what it looks like if you actually look at the photographs and follow the photographs around from at 2 p.m. on the northeast section, 3 p.m. on the southeast section. That's consistent with these photographs. And by 4 p.m., the fires moved from left to right or east to west. By 4 p.m., this whole area is clear of fire. And by 5 p.m., the whole floor is clear of fire. So contrast that to NIST's theories or their fire simulation, which shows fires burning, because they need those fires to justify their collapse initiation theory, which we'll get into right now. Here's Shyam Sunder.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
Okay, so fire induced a...
And you can see on the screen, the column at the very right is column 79. And that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining column.
So let's break this.
I'm just going to jump in and let you know that we're not seeing the graphic. We're not seeing the videos. We're just hearing it.
Thank you, Andy. Let me reshare that screen. We had a little technical glitch earlier, and I will reshare, stop, and then reshare that screen. Thank you so much for telling me. That's an easy fix. Yeah, stay on top of me, because these things happen. All right. So I'll show you this video again here. Come on. There we are.
And you can see on the screen, the column at the very right is column 79. And that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining column.
Now, all of that is going on the inside of the building. Let's break it down. We have the column 79, massive column, 700 pounds every foot of length on it. This is the floor where their fires are said to have been blazing. What they said is eventually it caused these beams to expand linearly, pushing this girder off of its seat on this column 79. Well, then the floor 13 falls on floor 12 after that girder falls off, and then floor 12 on floor 11, and so on for 9 floors, leaving column 79 unbraced, so at which it just buckles, and the entire series of floors fail all the way up to the east penthouse, and then that fails. There's a number of problems with this, but let's just take them one by one. The expanding columns, well, the fires were out here over an hour and a half prior to the collapse of anything. So those fires could not have been expanding these columns at or near the time of the collapse at all. Also, they put in their computer model in just a second and a half all of the heat of those fires. I got to check that heat, 1600 degree fires, something like that they were claiming. We have then the beams breaking their shear studs, which they say were on these beams, but then that pushes the girder off of its seat, because apparently it did not have shear studs, according to NIST. However, the shop drawings show that this girder clearly does have 30 shear studs, so it couldn't have gone anywhere, much less being pushed off of its seat on this column 79 by these beams here, which are 50 feet in length. But let's say that could have happened, and this girder could have been pushed off of its seat. You see the seat blown up here. NIST says it only had to be pushed halfway off of its seat on this column, because these flanges, this flange then just had to fold and break. But the problem there is that flange is supported by these 3/4 inch stiffeners, which are welded in place. You see here in elevation and here in plan. So NIST omits that key structural component, citing that they didn't have to put that stiffener in there because it was only there in order to keep the web from crippling or bending. And that also would have clearly supported the flange on top of that seat from folding. So that indeed, that girder would have had to have pushed all the way off of its seat. Anyway, even if that happened and this girder fell off of its seat, floor 13 couldn't have just fallen on 12. There's two other massive girders framing into that column. It would have kept most of that floor intact. And even this section of floor 13 could have fallen. It wouldn't even probably have reached the floor below, much less had the shear strength, the strength to break the shear on that, because it would have taken 10 times the amount of force, dynamic force, to break that connection on the girder connection to the column below. It would have taken 632,000 pounds, but it only had 60,000 pounds. So this is all extremely important, but let's go further and say that that floor could have fallen and that there was this internal cascading failure of these floors per NIST's computer animation. Well, then you would have seen massive breaking up of structural steel framing members on the perimeter. And because all of these beams are very carefully designed to be interlocked in this moment-resisting steel frame structure, and you would have had breaking up of windows and granite panels on the exterior in an incredible way. It would have been crumpling up like a beer can right here on all of these floors below the east penthouse. But that's not what happens in reality, as you saw in the video. But here's NIST's computer visualization, which is quite interesting because that's what it does show in unreality, or their computer simulation.
Here is our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event.
So what you see is 400 structural steel connections failing every second on the left side of their computer model. The right side, they didn't model, so it looks completely different. And even so, they only show us 2 seconds. Well, let's put it side by side to Building 7's collapse, and you can see if it matches quite well to the video or not. There's no breaking up of windows. Maybe there's a dozen windows that are broken because something clearly is going on in the building. And then their computer model stops in 2 seconds. Why? Well, it begins to tip over. They can't even fake their computer model enough to get it to look like the video. It begins to crumple up on the lower floors, as you'd expect in any structural failure that's involving the lower floors of a high-rise. So we submitted a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act, which you can do with federal agencies in the U.S. government, and they have to respond, but they have an out. One of the outs that they have is national security, which this is not, and so they use the other one. It might jeopardize public safety if we were to release this information. Wait a minute. Doesn't it jeopardize public safety if you were to release the computer input data to the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety? We need to know how this building came down. There's hundreds of similarly designed buildings out there. It's absolutely ridiculous that they can hide the computer data. So we use the scientific method with AE 911 Truth's work. We have a question. In this case, how did the building come down, right? We do some background research, make some observations. We construct hypotheses, reasonable hypotheses, that all of the hypotheses, maybe fire did bring it down. That's a reasonable hypothesis. Controlled demolition is a reasonable hypothesis, as we will see as we look at the evidence today. So we don't focus only on those hypotheses that are our favorites due to our financial or political obligations. For instance, we look at all the hypotheses, and we don't want to be We don't want to have our objectivity compromised by our close ties with the federal government, who has obviously a huge stake in maintaining this official story that they have been promoting. We analyze the results, we draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner for all to build on the body of our work. We don't hide the computer data. We don't refuse to give the architects and engineers out there our work so that it can be tested and objectively scrutinized. We report the results in an open, transparent manner. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back. We construct a new hypothesis until we have a hypothesis that's corroborated by all the data, the evidence, and so forth. That's what we're about today. That's what we're going to be doing. Let's start with some background research. Forces that destroy buildings. Let's look at them. Fire is certainly one of them. Let's start there. It's an organic, chaotic process. It burns out an area in roughly 20 or 30 minutes and moves on looking for fresh new fuel sources. So even NIST acknowledges that the fires can only persist in one location for about 20 to 30 minutes. And fires, by their nature, they creep from place to place as they run out of fuel. But how about that's in a wood frame building, because in wood frame buildings, you'd expect it not to fall straight down through the path of greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure, if there's that much there, of cold, hard, intact structure. It wouldn't just go straight down through. It might fall over. How about high rises? How do they act in massive fires? Well, here's one that was created, an 8-story building, in order to burn it down. Look at the incredible quantities of fuel we have here to try to reach up to 2,000 degree fires. And in this case, in Cardington in 1995, they set it on fire. And some of the beams, as you see here, are fireproofed and some of them are not. They wanted to see what each would do, what would happen here.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently. Of course, he's referring here to 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse primarily due to fire. And in the case of Building 7, only due to fire. But what happens with the connections? They remain intact. That's the strongest part of the building. The connections don't fail. The beams can sag. In this case, unprotected beams can sag or warp. They say in the executive summary, it's inherently stable due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. Well, we've had almost 100 very hot, large, and long-lasting fires in skyscrapers in the US. Let's take a look at a couple of them.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
Okay, so even after 9/11, we have a whole bunch of high rises that have caught on fire. None of these steel frame skyscrapers collapsed due to fire. It just doesn't happen. There's no precedent. And we're supposed to just assume that Building 7 came down as they're told and not question this. We have 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation as a result of this information. I'm hearing some strange things on my computer. So, are you hearing strange things, Andy?
My screen is flickering the mute button on and off, so I don't know.
Well, I muted you because I thought it was on your side.
It might be. There's something weird going on in my computer. I'm going to hit mute again.
Yeah.
Okay, and apparently we lost Richard, folks. So those are technical glitches that I warned us all about. They do happen. So hopefully Richard will be joining us again in just a moment. Let's come back to that with a lot of time. I'll jump back.
There's me, and we'll reshare. Hang on.
All right, you disappeared on us, Richard.
Yeah, I'm back though. I was trying to fix the problem and I made it worse.
Well, that's the first step a lot of times. Yeah, for some reason on my end, I just looked up and saw that the mute button was flashing on and off as if
oh, really?
On haywire. And so
that's crazy.
Yeah. So anyway, hopefully it's fixed. If not, we'll deal with it.
And I've got my private chat on too, if you want to leave me a message. And we should be, we're still broadcasting. So
right.
I think we're good. Let's keep going. So let's continue our research and find out what else happens to buildings. Well, they collapse due to natural causes. In this case, earthquakes. These buildings fell over. The building's still recognizable as a building when it falls down. It's certainly badly damaged, but the concrete is not turned to a fine powder. The columns and the beams are not severed one from another. So remember that, because this is the kind of features that differ distinctly with the features of the collapse of buildings 1, 2, and 7. We're talking about 7 today. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like smoke in buildings that are exploded. The third category of failures here. And we have sounds of explosions that are heard by witnesses, flashes of light that are seen by them. The explosions, due to the incredible hot gases, expand rapidly in cauliflower-shaped formation, and that's not typical even in buildings that fall over whatsoever, or buildings that are just on fire. And it's actually not true in most typical controlled demolitions. As you see here in these examples, there's a lot of dust because the concrete is broken up, and the gypsum board it's pulverized by lots of these explosions. But it's not this thick, billowing, rapidly expanding cauliflower-shaped forms, almost like in a volcano, which we'll be looking at a couple of examples of. So they do this by placing shaped cutter charges at the column and beam connections throughout the building. And they set them off in a very precise order to bring the building down how they want. So there's a set of features associated with these controlled demolitions. There's a sudden onset of destruction. It doesn't begin to creak and groan and, fall over, etc. It's sudden, and it's straight down, symmetrical into its own footprint. Feature number 3, well, there's a patterned set of explosions. That's what causes that, and that also results in feature number 4, a free fall acceleration straight down through what was the path of greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure underneath, but which has been compromised in this case by these explosions advancing ahead of the collapse, resulting in the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame. So that is a key feature. They don't want to have to go back and break it up afterwards. They want to break up as much of it as they can, but at the same time cause as little damage to adjacent buildings as possible. And then patterned explosions heard by witnesses. That's what we have here in the controlled demolition industry. Flashes of light seen by them. The concrete floors are broken up. They don't want to have to go back and jackhammer those floors at all odd angles, one at a time. Extremely dangerous work. Let the explosives do that work. And so those explosions are visible at many of the floors as a result. And it leaves behind chemical evidence of explosive devices. If you have these features, you have explosive evidence of destruction and evidence of explosive destruction. And these features are not created by fire, let alone all of them. If you have all these features, you can be pretty sure, gosh, that was a controlled demolition. Fires cause less robust structures to collapse, but asymmetrically, following the path of least resistance. So, with gradual deformations. So with additional evidence, corroborative evidence, circumstantial evidence, like government documentation, that can be very, very helpful in determining what's a controlled demolition. You don't just go into a burning building and set these charges in an afternoon. It takes months and approvals. And so there's foreknowledge of the destruction. Experts agreeing, at least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether something is a controlled demolition or not, along with video evidence we'll be looking at today. This is proof of controlled demolition, or can be. And such proof we're going to apply to Building 7 at this time. So let's get into it. Is there a sudden onset of destruction near the base of the structure? Let's go to Dan Rather. He's narrating our second view of this building's collapse.
And what you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down? Well, Dan's telling it like he sees it, right? You've all seen the old hotels in Las Vegas, and to be frank, it looks exactly like those. So here he is using his intuition. Great. But we didn't hear him talk about it after that day. In fact, we didn't see this building collapse on TV after 9/11 with two exceptions that I can note. And that was on Fox News, I think. And so let's keep going. Straight down, symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint. Is that what we have? Let's take a look from West Street. Pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. Also, you'll note the east penthouse is already collapsed. It was on the left side. And you also notice that a half a second prior to the overall collapse of this building, the entire screen wall and west penthouse on the right falls down into the building, indicating that the structure beneath it failed virtually all at once. Well, wait. NIST's theory is that after the east penthouse failed, that collapse went from left to right in 6 seconds, east to west. So we should have seen a gradual failure across this football field size building. But they collapse all at once, completely pulling out yet again the rug from NIST, who claims that this was a gradual failure, instability from left to right. So, and yes, it falls mostly into its own footprint, indicating, because the center of the pile is in the center of the building's footprint, that this was a symmetrical collapse. And maybe we're not quite sure yet. Let's put building 7 on the left, compare it to a series of controlled demolitions on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition? Especially since NIST, especially since fire, NIST's favorite and only hypothesis that they ever tested, has never brought down a skyscraper. Should controlled demolition have been the primary, if not the only, hypothesis tested by NIST? But no, it was relegated to a series of very frequently asked questions, which NIST finally had to respond to years after the final report came out, in which they asked, why did building 7 collapse? And they asked, did investigators consider the possibility that an explosion caused or contributed to the collapse? NIST concluded that blast events inside the building did not occur and found no evidence supporting existence of a blast event. The smallest blast capable of fouling the building's critical column would have resulted in a sound level of 130 decibels. And you would have heard that all around Manhattan. Well, we'll be looking at explosions that witnesses heard. Very much so. And yet these few small skyscrapers were, fires are said to have brought this building down symmetrically. Well, how do you do that? How do you bring a building down symmetrically? You have to take out all the columns at once. Otherwise, the building will begin to fall over. Especially if columns 79, 80, and 81 fell on the right side of this building. You know which way it's going to fall over. And that's been proven by the University of Alaska. We'll get into that in a moment. And so, but these are the small fires that brought this skyscraper down symmetrically. How fast is the building coming down? Let's go to physics teacher David Chandler, who has a little physics lesson for us, high school physics.
Just by watching it, anybody can see that building 7 fell close to free fall. To measure it, I used software to track the corner of the building and compute a graph of downward velocity as a function of time. The graph had a long, straight section indicating constant acceleration. Measuring the slope, I found the acceleration to be within 1% of the acceleration of gravity for the first 2.5 seconds. In other words, the building fell through its own structure with zero resistance.
Well, let's talk to some structural engineers about a building falling through its structure with zero resistance.
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
NIST is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them. The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite.
There is an equal and opposite reaction, and let's look at it. We have it over here.
Reaction.
Hang on one second. I'll be right back. There we go. Oh man, place is falling apart today. Sometimes the green screen fails, and when it does, I have to set up a whole new background. Anyway, even when columns are buckled, they still provide resistance. 25% of their capacity remains intact even after they're buckled 90 degrees. So that means it's impossible for the building to fall at free fall speed, indicating not one of those columns gave any resistance. Oh, NIST, in their infinite wisdom, says, oh, well, it finally, they say, admit that it did come down at free fall, but they simply say this is consistent with their existing results. Well, they were forced to admit free fall by members of AE 911 Truth who publicly embarrassed them into the reality that this is easily measurable. So let's go on. Feature number 5. Is the structural system totally dismembered? Yeah, it falls like a house of cards. Every column from every beam has been completely severed. It's a moment resisting steel frame structure that has fallen like a house of cards. The columns and beams are very rigidly welded to each other. They don't just break off like that. Remember, buildings that collapse due to natural causes, the columns and beams are not severed one from another. The building is recognizable as a building, semi-intact at least. Do we have limited damage to adjacent structures? Yes. There's some damage to the post office across the street, but the center of the pile is in the center of the building's footprint. Do we have sounds of explosions that are heard by witnesses? Let's go to Shyam Sunder first.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7. We ran down detailed computer simulations of blast scenarios. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse, nor reported by witnesses.
No? Well, let's look at a couple of them.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out. Then, it was horrifying. And then, about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that. And we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground.
A shock wave ripping through the building, the windows busting out. What does that sound like to you? How about this witness? This is Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic who was on site helping people. And this is what he hears.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when the compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
And this gentleman.
I'm going to call in Bill Rosati. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
And this gentleman, Barry Jennings, who, along with Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, they were trapped in the building. They didn't realize that it had been evacuated after the planes hit the towers, but before the towers came down. They got all the way up to the 23rd floor by stairs because these elevators weren't working. And this is their experience on the way back down.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions.
Also the sound?
Like a boom, like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run. What?
Bombs? Bombs like this one heard in the late morning of 9/11?
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
We're told that these sounds that people confused as explosions were actually buildings collapsing, but there's no other building collapsing after the towers had collapsed. All of these are not the sound of one floor hitting another or something like that. As we will see next week, there's a couple of hundred first responders and others who are hearing explosions even before the towers collapsed and even before the airplanes hit them in some cases. The official narrative says, gosh, this produced an event. Maybe we should look at this. Well, yeah, we should look at it. It's a 0.6 magnitude event. It's huge. But what happens here at 5:20 and 42 is the peak seismic signal. And that's 10 seconds, though, before the building collapsed. So how can the collapse of building 7 cause a peak seismic signal 10 seconds earlier? Doesn't make sense, right? Well, NIST has a way of making sense out of this. They say it's likely due to the falling of debris from the inside of the building. Well, that's only 6 seconds before, as you can see here. They're saying that's the falling of the debris right now by that east penthouse without any telegraphing and the exterior perimeter structural steel system breaking up granite panels. So 10 seconds before the overall collapse here, they're saying that signal, that peak signal was caused by internal debris hitting the ground. And then virtually no seismic signals after that, not of that magnitude. So Andre Rousseau comes into the picture in 2009 and 2012. We have, hold on one second. We have this applied geophysics expert, author of more than 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves and geology. What does he say? Because he looks at this very carefully. He says, gosh, the bell-like form points to an impulsive source of energy, not percussion on the ground due to the falling of debris. The seismic waves are only created by brief impulses, low frequencies. These undeniably have an explosive origin. Okay, well, let's go to the other evidence that's available here. Pyroclastic-like clouds, what do we make of that? Well, the National Fire Protection Association, Guide 921 for Fire and Explosion Investigations, which actually NIST helped to write. They should be very aware of its requirements, which include looking for large volumes. Oh, this is interesting. Large volumes of gas and large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. So what I'm going to have to do here, hang on, I'll need my my screen back so that I can see what you're seeing. And we're going to jump back to slide 175 and the slideshow there. Bring it back now from here. And there we go. And there we go. So let's look and see if that's indeed what we have here. Racing away from every direction from Building 7 at 35 miles an hour, these rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. Where is all that heat coming from? This is an incredible quantity of heat, and surely those few small and scattered fires in this building were extinguished by the kinetic energy of the building collapsing. We're talking about an order of this kind of heat. Where does that kind of heat come from? Well, let's look into it, because we do find it. In fact, NASA finds it first from their infrared sensitive cameras. They're discovering heat on the surface of the pile, 1,340 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, that's hotter than most office fires ever get. And yet surely those fires were extinguished, and there's no fire on the surface. So this must be evidence of something, which we found and we'll show you, of something much hotter deep down in the pile that is radiating up to the surface and cooling off by the time it gets to the surface to 1,340 degrees Fahrenheit, which is hotter than most office fires get. So let's get into who's studying this steel. Well, here's one, structural engineer Abelhausen Astani Azel. What does he say here? I saw melting of girders.
I saw melting of girders in World Trade Center.
Well, wait a minute. Girders don't melt in office fires. It takes 2,800 degrees to melt girders. These office fires were surely only 300 or 400 or 500 degrees. NIST claims 1,500 degrees. Well, clearly that's less than half, or about half, of the temperatures required to cause this kind of melting on this piece of steel from World Trade Center 7. What does the FEMA report author Jonathan Barnett say about the steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures? He has no idea how that happened. It takes 4,000 degrees, by the way, to evaporate steel. What can do that? Well, let's go back to FEMA, because in their report in 2002, the Building Performance Assessment Team created an Appendix C in which they document the results of their metallurgical examination on the steel, such as this piece of World Trade Center 7 steel. Never before observed, they say, eutectic reactions causing intergranular melting, turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese with silver dollar size holes. It's this huge mystery, which the New York Times called the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation. Where did the sulfur come from? Liquid iron, that's molten iron. Iron doesn't even begin to melt until 2800 degrees Fahrenheit. Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. Yet this information was completely eliminated from the NIST report when they took over in 2002, producing their own sanitized report, which we'll get into. NIST says, oh, we couldn't test for explosives. We couldn't find any steel from World Trade Center 7. But we just looked at a piece of steel. The steel was documented in a limited metallurgical examination. But again and again, NIST lies and says they couldn't find any steel. No metallography could be carried out. No steel recovered. But here's their co-project leader, John Gross, standing on the pile, identifying the very piece of steel whose ends of the beam was partly evaporated. This is the very piece that was cut off and given to FEMA to study and include in their metallurgical examination. His shadow is all over the evidence. The fires are maybe 1200 degrees, according to Thomas Eiger, but steel doesn't melt till almost 2800 degrees. What could produce that? Well, buildings are hydrocarbons. They can only get to be about 600 to 1400 degrees. Even jet fuel doesn't burn any hotter than that, according to its manufacturer. But there's no jet fuel at Building 7, right? But steel had definitely melted. In fact, you can see by the color of the material held in the hands of this crab claw excavator, the dripping molten white and yellow tells us, because of the physics of molten iron and steel, you can tell that it is 2500 degrees. What caused it to melt? Let's look at one reasonable hypothesis, which is thermite. As we look for forensic evidence of incendiaries here, could thermite have produced all that molten metal? Well, what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermite were used, then it would explain the presence of 4,000 degree heat, because that's what it produces. It would explain the presence of sulfur, because sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. And it would explain the presence of molten iron, elemental iron that's been melted. This is not steel that's been melted, interestingly enough. We haven't used elemental iron in our skyscrapers for 100 years. Where did the iron come from? We're going to see there's an awful lot of it in a moment. Well, the National Fire Protection Guide 921 says, look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite or other pyrotechnic materials. NIST says, we found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Later, a year later, they admit in writing, NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find what you won't look for, but others did. One of them, Stephen Jones, a nuclear physicist formerly from Brigham Young University, is sent a sample from this particular sculpture in the Peace Park in Manitoba. One of the things he notes is that, gosh, this is highly irregular cut through here. This isn't the kind of cut that they do with oxyacetylene torches and thermal lances. So, like you see here, this is a very clean, very, very hot cut. So no, something else is going on with these kinds of cuts with thick slag also. And like you see here. So he takes a sample of this slag and he does X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy and finds what? We have iron, key ingredient of thermite. Aluminum, key ingredient of thermite. And manganese, which becomes very important. And sulfur. Again, there's that sulfur that nobody could identify from official sources. Potassium. And we have some other studies that have been done by the U.S. Geological Study on all U.S. Geological Society. I think it's USGS, U.S. Geological Society. And all the dust samples, hundreds of them, they get very, very clear results from what's in them in their report in 2005. They find billions of what? Previously molten iron microspheres. We're going to unpack that because they don't know where they came from. They have no idea. But all the dust samples have them. Up to 6% of these dust samples are composed of these iron spheres that they have no idea where they came from. There's up to 4 tons of this material in the dust. 150 times the background level of iron, which can be in common dust. R.J. Lee Group finds them in independent, private, environmental consulting firm. They said they're formed during the event, not before by the welders, not after by the iron workers taking apart the steel. Well, there's so many of them and they're so ubiquitous that the EPA designated them as a distinguishing element, a signature component to confirm what is World Trade Center dust and what is not. Well, how would you make iron microspheres? Well, here's a thermite experiment under controlled conditions, a small one, where you see thousands of sparks slowing it down halfway. What they look like sparks, but they're liquid molten iron, which is what thermite issues under pressure that would form itself into spheres because aerosolized liquids do that due to their surface tension. And they would fall around the World Trade Center. And could that be what's responsible for the toasting of the tops of these cars? What other rational explanation within the official narrative or outside of it could explain the toasting? And of these cars in this very high heat event. You can make thermite in your backyard, by the way. You could buy it on eBay. It's just iron oxide and aluminum powder. Iron oxide is basically rust and fine aluminum powders. Here's John Cole's experiment. Don't try this at home. But if you do want to get into it, you'll find that there are much cleaner, more sophisticated devices that can cut through much thicker sections of structural steel more effectively. They were patented prior to 1999, prior to 2001, by the way. They can issue thermite charge streams, cutting the steel in hundreds of milliseconds. Much more effective even than high energy explosives like C4 or RDX, which are used primarily in controlled demolitions because they're cheaper, but they don't have the ability to cut through 4-inch thick sections of steel like thermite does. And there are devices patented prior to 9/11 whose casings themselves are made up of consolidated thermite, which is consumed, but that would leave molten iron pools around for everybody to see. And that's what we'll be showing you in week 3, part 3 of this 3-week series, 9/11 An Architect's Guide. This is just part 1. But what else was found in the World Trade Center dust? Let's look into it, because a team of 8 international scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen collect samples from all over the place, including they're given to them because people have heard about their work. So Jeanette McKinley, for instance, collected some of the dust from her apartment across the street from the South Tower. This dust was blown into her apartment. All the windows were blown out in the building she was in. And she collects it. She was an artist. And she actually worked with it to make art projects and ended up dying tragically of brain cancer several years later. She paid for that dearly, but one of these samples is hers. These are red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other, which are found in all the World Trade Center samples that they collected. There's, by extrapolation, there's about 10 tons of this material in the World Trade Center dust. They get real curious because it's attracted by a magnet, so it's not paint. And it's dual layered, red and gray. So it seems obvious that it was applied in a fluid such as paint. But they zoom in, and what do they find in the red layer? Iron oxide and aluminum powders, along with silica, oxygen, carbon, which we'll come back to. So they get real curious. What are the ingredients of thermite doing in these red-gray chips? They zoom in 50,000 times with an electron microscope and discover nano-sized particles of these iron oxide rhomboidal-shaped crystals and aluminum platelets. They're 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. And they're set in a bed of oxygen, silica, carbon, organic materials. Well, organic materials is what's used to expand and provide the incredible concussive force that's characteristic of TNT, RDX, C4, high energy explosives. So something very interesting is going on here. Well, they put it in a heater, a differential scanning calorimeter, and it produces all this energy when it reaches about 750 degrees centigrade. And so they confirm that it's an exothermic reaction, which is what thermite does. They also confirm that iron spheres are produced when they set them off in this heater, with the same chemical signature as the iron spheres produce in the World Trade Center dust. So you see, we know where these iron spheres came from that are in throughout the World Trade Center dust. As if we didn't know, they're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips found in the World Trade Center samples, as you see here and here. So this is a self-corroborating, reproducible set of experimental data that can be used in a court of law to bring the real perpetrators of 9/11 to justice. So this is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. This is extremely sophisticated material. When you bring down to the nano scale these particles, the chemical reaction is virtually instantaneous. So you've turned or engineered an incendiary, which works by means of heat, to become more explosive. It's not made by people who don't really know what they're doing. So, and it's not difficult to find the people that do. This is documented in a 25-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. The red layer is unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology. It's a highly energetic pyrotechnic material. This paper stands uncontested in the peer-reviewed literature. The way to contest somebody's conspiracy theory, if you will, is to produce a paper of your own documenting that it is what you believe to be the truth. And this has not been done, not for 10 years, since 2009. So what we've been looking at is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. A fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, which we'll be looking at. Let's look at these fires first. Experts said no modern steel frame reinforced high-rise has ever collapsed due to an uncontrolled fire. Why did this one collapse? Well, we've kind of shown that, right? But in terms of the actual fires in Building 7, the reason that we don't lose these skyscrapers is because, one, the steel conducts that heat away. It's very conductive from its source. So the source never really gets to 1200 degrees rarely, which is the temperature, 1200 Fahrenheit, that steel can begin to sag. It loses half of its strength at that temperature. We don't want that to happen, so we fireproof the steel. And the steel in Building 7 was indeed fireproofed to code, providing 2 and 3 hour fire protection, which is 6 times the amount of protection it needs to keep, because as NIST even acknowledged, fires only burn in one area for 20 to 30 minutes. They move on looking for a new fuel source. So we also keep the tenants from bringing in huge fuel loads for the fire. You only have desks and chairs and rugs, paper. We don't allow contractors to build the high rises out of combustible materials in this country anyway. And just to keep all that from becoming a problem, we put up fire extinguishing systems, which were put on test mode, as acknowledged by NIST, before 9/11. So they weren't even ever able to extinguish the fires that were in there. And even so, those fires did not get out of control. As we'll go into some detail next week. There were investigations into the collapse of Building 7. FEMA came along first with volunteers and finally got $600,000 worth of funding. Their efforts were hampered quite a bit, according to the New York Times. They couldn't get access to the blueprints, couldn't get access to the site, couldn't get access to the steel in any appreciable measure, and nor the public to get photos and videos. So along comes 2008, NIST's final report after it comes out, and they launched their report with the stated conclusion that fires caused the collapse in 2002. So they weren't looking to what caused the collapse, even though FEMA had doubts about what really caused the collapse. And they admit in 2006, we've had trouble getting a handle on Building 7. Well, FEMA produced the report that we looked at. What was their conclusion? Further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue. Hold on one second. So surely we have preserved in easily the most puzzling structural failure in modern history, Building 7. The evidence was preserved. No. We have, within 2 weeks after 9/11, 400 truckloads a day carting the steel out, put on barges, shipped to China for recycling before investigators could do a proper investigation. Prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out, crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. What did the experts say? At least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion. Here's Danny Jawenko, an expert in Europe on controlled demolition.
Danny Jawenko is the expert on this in Europe. What did he say?
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Het heeft een team gedaan van experts.
And Hugo Bachmann, Professor Emeritus, Chairman of the Department of Structural Dynamics and Earthquake Engineering. In my opinion, World Trade Center 7 was with great probability professionally demolished. One of 100 structural engineers signed on to our petition at AE 9/11 Truth, Kamal Obeid, a localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Does fire do that? No. Prompting also the University of Alaska at Fairbanks to accept the challenge of studying this building's failure. Professor Leroy Halsey, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, chairman of their environmental civil engineering, along with his PhD researchers, conduct a very detailed analysis over a period of 4 years. They start out saying, well, gosh, no other steel frame building had ever failed due to fire. We have to understand the failure mechanism here for the public safety. So, okay, here's what we're going to do. Examine the response to the fire loads, rule out scenarios that would not cause the collapse, identify the type of failures that could have contributed to the collapse. And they go about this using the same assumptions that NIST used, proving that, by the way, in the process, that most of those assumptions were erroneous. But they wanted to compare apples to apples, so they used NIST's assumptions. The methodology includes 3 approaches. 1, simulate local structural response to fire loading for floors 13 and below, where NIST was focusing. 2, examine the collapse initiation offered by NIST. And then 3, simulate numerous failure scenarios, identify how this collapse could have occurred. So they first put all of this in AutoCAD software program, and then use Abacus software, structural engineering analysis, finite element analysis, to determine what happened, focusing in the area that NIST was focusing on with these long span beams and this girder and column 79. And they do analysis such as finding, what happens at that connection with that girder to that column. And they challenge these assumptions, which we've already discussed, in relation to the omitted key structural components that allowed NIST to come up with its faulty conclusions, such as at the east wall, where most of the movement due to the fire would have been out. The window would have bowed out. Yet they found that NIST assumed an infinite stiffness in this wall, not allowing it to go everywhere, forcing the movement up to 6 inches, as you saw us discuss earlier, inward. So anyway, with approach 1, NIST finds that those assumptions and conclusions were clearly wrong on NIST's part. And they find that more of their conclusions were wrong. And they find that, gosh, if indeed columns 79, 80, and 81 did fail, which they could not have failed due to fire, that the building would have tipped over, as seen here in. Is this going to tip over? It better. Let's try it again. Yeah. So you take out column 79, and guess what? It's on the east side, on the right. It tips over to the right. No big revelation here, right? This is obvious stuff. So they conclude that the collapse of World Trade Center 7 was a global failure, not a progressive collapse involving the sequential failure of columns throughout the building, one by one. So in the global failure scenario, gosh, the building collapses pretty much straight down as the videos show. The videos of the actual collapse. So the essential findings are the fire did not cause the collapse of World Trade Center 7. Temperature was not high enough to cause the weakening of the steel frame. Thermal expansion did not result in a loss of support for the beams and the girders. World Trade Center 7 did not experience a progressive collapse, but a global collapse caused by what? The near simultaneous failure of all the columns in the building. And when you put them all side by side, you ask yourself, what more closely resembles the actual collapse? The University of Alaska's modeling on the right, or the US government's modeling on the left, which stops after 2 seconds and shows nothing that resembles the actual collapse. So we look at one other key feature of a controlled demolition, and that is foreknowledge of the destruction. People know in advance, such as this anonymous engineer who predicts the collapse in 5 hours. Yeah, if we allow it to burn, the chief says, how long could we predict a collapse? He was pretty much right on the money in about 5 hours. So here is an engineer who has predicted the collapse, an unprecedented collapse. This building had a few small fires, as you've seen. And yet he's predicting it in advance to the hour when it's never happened before, ever, due to fires alone. The prediction could only have been made with foreknowledge, right? We don't get to know who this engineer is. He doesn't tell us. We would love to talk to that engineer. We'd love to talk to these guys who are captured on camera walking away from building 7, hearing an explosion over their shoulder, looking back at building 7, looking straight into the CNN camera and saying this.
You hear that?
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
Building is about to blow up. Move it back.
All right, guys.
We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame, debris coming down.
The building is about to blow up, flame and debris coming down. How do they know? And what did this gentleman, Kevin McPadden, experience? He was held back with everybody else, and he's listening to a radio held in the hands of a Red Cross worker. And before he experiences those explosions he talked about earlier today, he hears this on the radio.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
3, 2, 1. Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? What's going on here? How do they know that the building is about to come down? How was it announced by the BBC 20 minutes before it happened? I'm not kidding you. Listen to this.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy.
Sketchy indeed. They even have the reason for the building's collapse. How about CNN, who announces the collapse of this building 6 hours earlier?
In New York, Alan Dodds-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Alan, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke. It was like a forest fire roaring down a canyon. Now, as I think Patty Sack and others have told you, all of Manhattan is covered, downtown Manhattan is covered with thick white ash and building material.
Wow. Was Building 7 supposed to come down at that time? Were those mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7 and then hearing an explosion part of the team that fixed a dud that kept the building from going down? Had it gone down at that time, we wouldn't even have any videos of it because it would have been completely obscured by the massive dust cloud when the Twin Towers went down. Well, we can speculate about that. But while we're speculating, let's listen to Larry Silverstein's interesting interview 1 year after 9/11 on PBS. Here he is talking about Building 7.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Wait a minute. They made the decision to pull? Firefighters don't pull buildings. This is a term used in the controlled demolition industry. Larry says, I didn't mean pull the firemen. I didn't mean pull the building. I meant pull the firemen out of the building. Well, the firemen weren't allowed in the building to fight the fire. There were no firefighting operations, due in part to the damage for the World Trade Center North Tower. They were kept out of the building. No manual firefighting operations taken. No firefighting. And by the way, firefighters don't go into burning buildings to plant explosives. Nobody does that. This was done, had to have been done months in advance. So what is the hypothesis that the evidence supports for you? Is it destruction due to fire or destruction due to controlled demolition? We've given you the evidence that you have to support the 10 key features of controlled demolition. To us, this indicates direct evidence of destruction with explosives. None of these support destruction by fire. None of these features can be caused by fire. With additional circumstantial corroborative evidence and testimony, we believe, along with 3,000 architects and engineers, that this evidence supports the hypothesis of controlled demolition. So we're asking you to get the word out. We'll talk about that. In fact, right now, Andy, how do people ask questions? Because after that, we want to take some questions.
Absolutely. Okay. Please submit any questions that you might have in the same input form we were talking about earlier. That's at ae911truth.org. Just go to continuing education and select the live webinars. There's a box right there. While you're doing that, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you're informed, you agree that this evidence is compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Great. And that's all done right here, as Andy mentioned. But while you're there, subscribe to our bulletins. We are constantly, not constantly, every week or two, sending out something that is of interest, new evidence, new packaging of evidence, new progress toward a real investigation. We've got a lot to share with you. So take a minute and just put your email in there. Get informed also. On our website, we have an incredible evidence section with many more documents and videos that can be very helpful to you. Sign the petition too. Support the 3,000 architects and engineers. We have more than 20,000 of you doing just that already. That you can do that right here on our website. Add your name and donate while you're doing that, because we have a staff of 6 that is busy full-time about getting you the information that you need to get a real investigation. If you care about this, support us. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and so your donation is tax deductible typically. So avail yourselves of that opportunity and become a member of AE 911 Truth for the cost of a cup of coffee a month. You can support us. And there's thousands of you doing that keep us going. But we're not able to do everything we need to do because we don't have enough members yet. So please do support us now. And if you can't do that, Andy, aren't there some ways people can volunteer here at AE 911 Truth?
There are always ways people that can volunteer for us, especially if you got a few hours a week open and you're willing to work and get right into it and follow the plan that so many other volunteers have followed, have been successful with. Depending on what the project is, we got opportunities for you to call people on the phone. The targets are different all the time, so it never gets boring. There's always some kind of new outreach opportunity that involves calling someone. If you're somebody that likes to work alone, we certainly have research opportunities for you to not just research on 9/11, but also just getting the data that we need. I got some amazing people here on the volunteer team that sometimes get stuff to me overnight. Now, you're not going to be required to do that. They've got a certain skill set, but definitely you can help out in that kind of way. And if you've just got some kind of skill that is very useful, I mean, we got a translations team that gets everything translated out to all of these different languages, some of them I never even heard of, and people who help us out with videos and things like that. So there's a number of ways that you can help us, but the first step is that you got to go to ae911truth.org. It's a very short application. Within a few days, we'll get in touch with you, see where you'll best fit, and get you involved. And now is the time to get involved as well. So many people are waking up, whether it be because they've seen our information or because of current events. I have friends that were dismissing me who sound more quote unquote conspiratorial than I do now at this point, and are woken up to 9/11 on top of so many other things. So this is the time to get active and push this issue to the forefront. So please get involved.
Thank you, Andy. And gosh, if you don't like working with people, but you want to do something, you can do it right from your own chair. That's how I started. Contact your local representatives, television, radio, newspaper. Send the AE911truth.org link to every architect and engineer that you can find in your community and everybody else that you know. How easy is that? Blame it on us. Let them call us the conspiracy theorists. All you have to do is show them our work and say, what do you think about this? And screen the AE911 DVDs. I'll show you an example of one really good one to screen coming up here. But we have brochures also, 100 of them for $10 you can pick up in our store. All the evidence is right there in a nutshell. We share the results of the Alaska study that I mentioned. Professor Leroy Halsey has got a 132-page paper. You can download it right from our website and share that with structural engineers. We have taken that material and we have packaged it and we have sent it to NIST and we have said, here's 8 key points in which we believe you have essentially committed fraud. They have now written back and said, no, we're going to stand by our existing study. So we're appealing that, and the results of that appeal will be forthcoming. And then if that is unsatisfactory, we will sue them. Speaking of opportunities for a real investigation, here's one. Andy, tell people about this one.
Right. And for years, we have asked on the website for people to sign this petition that asks Congress to investigate the destruction of the 3 towers. A couple of years ago, we said, hey, let's do most of the work for them. We wrote the draft legislation. It's called the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. It's named after Bobby McIlvaine, who tragically died on the morning of September 11th from an explosion. So, of course, his father has been an advocate for us for many years. And what this would do is look into the evidence that Richard is bringing to you every week, has been bringing to you since 2007. And the legislation is written in such a way that it would create a select committee that they have to look into this possibility, not just bring NIST, members of NIST out in front of Congress to regurgitate some talking points, but actually look at the evidence that we've been bringing to the forefront for years. But as we all know, as we all have learned through years of activism, members of Congress don't do things they'd rather not do unless they hear from their constituents. So that is where you get involved. Now, I'm glad that we can talk about this now, because I meant to say when I was talking about the volunteers that we could also use a lot of help with congressional outreach. It doesn't require any specific skill. It just requires effort and being willing to do the work. So if you're interested in that, start filling out the petition, or rather the volunteer form, because we're going to be really boosting it after the anniversary this year. But a lot of it just involves letting them know that you are out there and getting other people to join your side and join the call for a new investigation. You can get educated on it by going to ae911truth.org/justice. It'll tell you all about the act on there. You could print out some materials to give to congressmen if they ever leave their offices again. And you can also email them. Very simple. You just put your address in and it'll generate a letter. You can just look it over, make sure you agree with it, and hit send, and it'll go right to their inboxes. But all of these things are needed, and when they're ready to look at September 11th again and to the destruction of these 3 towers, it'll be the Bobby McIlvaine Act all ready to go for them. We just got to get them to that point.
Yeah, it's all written there, isn't it, Andy?
Exactly.
All they have to do is introduce it into legislation, and we are running. So help us with that, folks. Make an appointment with your rep. As Andy mentioned, we'll do the appointment for you. All you have to do is show up. How easy is it? We submitted this evidence and evidence for the Twin Towers, which we're going to be looking at in week 2 and 3 of this 3-part series, next Thursday and the Thursday after. And it is very compelling. In fact, the U.S. attorney promised in writing to comply with the law, which requires him to give this to a special grand jury. He didn't do that, actually, but we sued him for it in a mandamus action, and that's pending. We sued the FBI also, and that's pending. So stand by. All this is the reason that 5 New York area city commissioners have voted unanimously for a resolution demanding a new investigation. In fact, Chris Joya says, you better believe that when the entire fire service of New York State is on board, we will be an unstoppable force. So he's deeply committed. So I want to show you this, just a sneak peek of this landmark documentary, which we've invited 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out the evidence for the destruction, explosive destruction of these 3 towers. Here's just a peek.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed a petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Yeah, you can watch it for free on YouTube. The 1 hour version. The hour and a half version, though, comes with a DVD, Meet the Experts, with additional footage from all 40 of these experts. It's extraordinary. I encourage you to get it at our store, ae911truth.org. You'll find the online store there. You can also download the Misinformation Beyond Misinformation booklet for free at beyondmisinformation.org. And you can buy the coffee table high quality version also. I think it's $10 or so. And you can get a lot of these things are free, like our classic lecture, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth. It's presentation, free on YouTube, or the DVD version also. And as is the 15-minute documentary on Building 7, the one we did in 2013, I believe it was. And that's extraordinary. Just 15 minutes, all the evidence is right there. Of course, we got a new World Trade Center 7 documentary coming out, which is being directed by Dylan Avery. So we'll get you information on that. In fact, don't miss the online conference. I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you that on September 11th, 12th, and 13th in the evening, we're going to have some incredible speakers here. David Ray Griffin, Stephen Jones, Niels Harrit, James Corbett, Danielle Ganser from Switzerland, expert on false flags and wars of terror following 9/11. John Whitehead from the Rutherford Institute, constitutional attorney, the advancing police state. We'll be talking about the request for correction. The Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry will be here. We'll be going into other details about actions we have. We'll be going over this evidence as well. All this happens the evening of September 11th, which is Friday, and then Saturday, and then Sunday, 3 hours each evening. So be sure to join us. It is really going to be special right here at ae911truth.org. You can get more information right on the website. Well, let's answer some questions. What do you think, Andy?
Absolutely. Now, this first one, it's a little complicated, so I'm going to try to read it really slow here. If stage 1 of the NIST graph for Building 7 starts when a pixel on the center of the roof line changes color, then isn't NIST kind of indirectly admitting that the entire roof line only starts falling at stage 2 of the graph, where the free fall portion of their graph happens? And is this collapse start time one of the requests for correction, where the real truth is that there is not as much as 40% more collapse time than a free fall time as NIST claims there is?
Excellent points. NIST is trying to get out. First of all, they're trying to get out. They denied that the building came down at free fall at all. And then we embarrassed them publicly, as I mentioned, in a press conference. David Chandler and Stephen Jones both said this is publicly available information. Come on. I mean, you can test it very easily. And so then after that, they said, well, there's still this period of collapse, which is not in free fall. And you're right. They found that by watching the change of a pixel color. A pixel is a little integer of information on your monitor, displayed on your monitor as a pixel. And therefore used that as the initiation of collapse and say, well, it didn't fall suddenly because it fell gradually. It's absolutely ridiculous. All you have to do is use your intuition. A 7th grader can look at this and say, yeah, that looks just like this other one, other building under controlled demolition. Anyway, and then they tried to deny the actual implications of free fall they deny it by saying, well, this is consistent with our previous reports. It's not consistent at all. If a building is falling for a third of its 7-second fall at free fall, as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky, then not one column, and there's more than 80, not one gave any resistance to that free fall. What happened to those columns? They had to have been removed instantly, within a second of each other, according to the University of Alaska's study. Exterior columns at once, followed by the interior columns all at once, followed a second or so later by the exterior columns. This is direct evidence of explosive destruction, and NIST is on the hook for it, and they're feeling the heat. So, Andy, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that one?
No, I think you pretty much covered it. I think they are feeling the heat from it now, and our actions are just going to continue on, and till the eventual inevitable ending of this, where they're going to have to be forced to admit, or at least go back and reanalyze their data and put out a new report. I really believe that. We just got to keep on putting.
This is complicity in treason, though, Andy. I mean, we're not just talking about falsifying a report. We're talking about covering up mass murder and treason, because as we'll get to, the evidence shows that the Twin Towers were also blown up by explosive demolition, and they were occupied at the time.
All right. Well, I'm trying to be gentle here in this webinar. I absolutely agree, though. And I think, if there's people who are whistleblowers that were involved and knew something was going down with this report, and that they were not being forthright and doing an honest investigation, they need to speak out now, especially if they get into retirement age and, where they're not so concerned about their career anymore. They need to speak out about this, because you don't want to be involved in whatever the outcome whatever outcome may come as a result of this work that we're doing. Our next question says, NIST says there are other similar buildings as Building 7. Why does NIST allow themselves to tell us that the failure of column 79 happened to cause the collapse without that information jeopardizing public safety?
Oh, they're between a rock and a hard place, as usual. And as your excellent questions point out, they did tell us that it might jeopardize public safety if we were to give you the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety. So we can't give you this information. Well, there are similarly designed buildings. Now, this building had some unique features. Down at the 5th floor, there was a huge truss system because the building was built over the top of a Con Edison substation. But none of that unique structure is any part of the official cause of this building's collapse. As you know, they start up at the 12th and 13th floor. So NIST can't have it both ways. They can't tell us that this is a similarly designed building as other structures above that 5th floor, and say that there's no problem with these other buildings. They did try to hedge their bet there. They did come out with a set of recommended fireproofing upgrades that were improvements to the existing International Building Code, but none of the structural recommendations that they made, which would keep a progressive collapse from ever happening, were included in the International Building Code. So they have egg on their face here, because the Conference of International Building Officials know that their buildings are safe as they are. They don't want to make them 10 times more expensive. They don't want to shut down the high-rise construction industry, as we've now shut down our economy due to COVID-19 and almost destroyed it. But that's another topic.
Yeah, and I just want to add on to that, because I was going to say that we've learned that they can do a lot. They claim in the name of public safety, if they have what they believe to be a legitimate public safety risk. So if there is this risk now that buildings can suddenly come falling down as a result of a few random office fires, Why aren't they finding buildings that haven't gone through these steps to do something about it? Why aren't they releasing the data? Why aren't they shutting down the businesses that operate in these buildings and condemning them until they do something about their columns and preventing thermal expansion from happening? So none of it makes any sense, of course, because we know it was a controlled demolition. But that is a great argument to bring up now because of what's happening in current events. Okay, and this last one is just a YouTube comment. It's something we hear often, but every once in a while it's good to revisit it. It says, the amount of evidence is overwhelming. Why do people not even want to look?
The evidence is overwhelming, and people don't want to look. We can't afford to look. It's too big. The implications are so vast for our own internal world view. It turns us upside down. When I came across this information in 2006, late March, I think it was March 26th or 27th, I was just shocked that I didn't know a third tower collapsed. I was shocked that I hadn't heard anything about explosions outside of the airplane impacts in the Twin Towers. I was shocked that there was this whole body of evidence, which is absolute proof of controlled demolition. I was shocked that the media didn't pick up any of it. That if what we're talking about here is true, I would be that means that there'd be some conspiracy across government and industry, and particularly the media, the legislative system, the opposition party, the Democrats at that time, the Republican Party, the judicial system, in which lawsuits, this kind of evidence has been brought forth in lawsuits, all of that incredible size and number of bodies and people would be silent to it, as if this incredible body of evidence never happened. And so it seems inconceivable that such a conspiracy could happen. So you don't look at the evidence. And so people are they immediately, kind of freak out inside and say, oh, I can't look at that. That's too much for my big ego or my little ego either way. We can't handle it. It turns us upside down. It means that this world is not as safe as we thought it was. It means the people ruling it are organized in a fashion that we don't want to even begin to imagine. And so, these building failures are just the beginning of the rabbit hole for people. And as technical building experts, we talk about buildings, but we're not naive at all. We understand that this is really about freedom and the loss thereof after 9/11, $6.5 trillion global war on terror, the loss of our civil liberties through the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012. We've invaded countries in which 2 million people have perished. We're in trouble, and all of this stands, and it's getting worse now due to the reactions on the part of government to the COVID-19 scare. So, we all have to wake up, and this is a starting point. We think 9/11 is the domino, which will really help people to get it. Once they look at the evidence, they start really go, what else are they lying to me about? You know, the world changes when you step down into these rabbit holes. But it changes for the better because truth heals, and only the truth heals. We will never be healed by a lie. Sweeping the stuff under the rug is not the path to freedom. The path to freedom is painful, but we have to go there. So join us next week as we go there into part 2, the Twin Towers explosive destruction. The truth is greater, but it's a painful path through it. But we're going to go through it together next Thursday, and then the Thursday after that, part 3, the Twin Towers in extreme heat. So do join us. Until then, I'd like to thank Andy and all of you for listening. And we will see you next Thursday, 1 o'clock Pacific. Thanks.